Thank you, Gail, really for inviting us into your home for this celebration, and thank you, Gwen, for getting us off to such a great start. As Gail mentioned, this was the very first grant that the Rockefeller Foundation made when we were incorporated in 1913, attributed to the construction of the beautiful building where we had the reception. It was Gore Vidal who said, "I wouldn't have missed this century for the world." And I think that's the sentiment we share here tonight, and what a century it's been. We spent the first half of our day looking forward, discussing some of the really interesting big bets that philanthropy is making, bets that have created the potential to really make transformations that will define our second century. All the work we do together as philanthropy focuses on the people who benefit from our ideas and from our impact, on the beneficiary whose lives and livelihoods drive our mission and our passion, the families who struggle to make ends meet, the people whose lives will benefit from the next breakthrough in neuroscience, the young children whose next birthday may depend on receiving that life-saving vaccine. They are not only part of our year-long centennial celebration, they are surely the inspiration behind it. But tonight, I'd like to do something a little different. Tonight, at our final centennial event, I want to focus my attention and my toast on the people who make that impact happen, the unsung heroes who dedicate their careers to this work, who often pass up higher-paying offers or more comfortable livelihoods because they believe that not only is this work worth doing, they believe it is the only work worth doing. I'm not just talking about the founders or the leaders, but the grant officers and the program associates who work directly with the people on the ground who are carrying out the work, the strategists, the operations staff, the communications professionals, our executive assistants who keep everything running so smoothly. These are actually some of the stories that I want to tell tonight, and we have so many to tell from the Rockefellers' 100 years of wonderful opportunities, and they are contained in more than 2 miles of memos and correspondences, annual journals and trip reports, and they are meticulously kept in the Foundation's archives. I promise not to give you all of them tonight. But for a time, it was required, and we could never do this today, but it was required that Rockefeller Foundation program officers keep elaborate and specific daily diaries, not just detailing the decisions that were made, but actually providing the characters real animation, providing the context of their decisions, and so often really animating the human consequences of making those decisions. But they revealed something else about the people who turned the wheels of our philanthropic institutions. They are positively and unapologetically human. And they were dealing with many of the same things that we deal with today. On the matter of receiving visitors who dropped into the office simply saying hello, or more typically seeking funding, Warren Weaver, who led the Foundation's Natural Sciences Division for over 3 decades, wrote a comprehensive guide for the Foundation titled, "How Do You Do, Dr. X?" He begins, "A basic matter that must always be remembered is that anybody who comes to the Rockefeller Foundation should be treated courteously and should leave with the feeling that he has had a fair reception. However, Weaver makes a single exception. An officer should not be drawn into dealing with a complete nut." An experienced secretary in the division can feel out the situation when the receptionist suspects that the visitor is a nut. The receptionist, after all, cannot and should not be expected to make that decision. She might exclude some of our favorite friends. I think we all have a few friends who come to mind. Other stories reveal the internal squabbling surrounding the medical schools that were vying to get the first school of public health. I won't name names, but we all know them very well. But while humor and gossip are very heavily represented, these officers were mostly dealing quite literally with life and death. Tragically, sometimes their own. Dr. Hideo Noguchi had risen from extreme poverty in Japan to become a very distinguished researcher at the Rockefeller Institute. In 1925, he believed that he had found the causative agent of yellow fever, one of the big killers at the time, and he developed the first vaccine. A year later, the vaccine was shown not to treat yellow fever, but another unrelated bacterial disease. Dr. Noguchi traveled then to the Rockefeller Laboratory in Lagos, Nigeria, to aid in the next phase of the research, but he would succumb to the disease himself 7 months later in 1928. The loss of Dr. Noguchi weighed very heavily on the minds of the Rockefeller team. In a letter from Paul Hudson to his colleagues in New York on the death of Dr. Noguchi and another scientist, Hudson writes, "I cannot help but feel that their lives were not laid down in vain, and my greatest hope is that something will come of this work that will in part repay the world for their loss. A vaccine would be developed less than a decade later. Indeed, we see so many tales in these archives of Rockefeller Foundation officers trying to save lives. Let me tell you about one. Alexander McKinsey, a foundation officer who was stationed in the European office in France, helped hundreds of Jewish scholars escape Nazi persecution in Europe and helped to place them in positions in US universities. By the 1940s, or actually by 1940 itself, Rockefeller's Refugee Scholars Program had helped place 214 displaced scholars. But as the conditions in Europe deteriorated, it was clear to both foundation staff and the leadership that they were not just making decisions about saving scholarship and saving science. They were making decisions about saving lives. In 1940, McKinsey was contacted by Otto Meyerhoff, a German Jewish physiologist who had won the Nobel Prize. He had moved his family to Paris. But after the Germans invaded France, it was clear to Meyerhoff that he had to get out of Europe entirely and quickly, or risk a concentration camp or worse. McKinsey secured a position for Meyerhoff at the University of Pennsylvania, and he bought tickets for the whole family for a ship bound to the United States in July. But as the time came for the departure, McKinsey realized that he would not be able to get the Meyerhoffs on the voyage. He didn't have enough funds, or actually not enough bribes, to offer the dockmen, and their places had already been given to others who did. And so McKinsey arranged for Meyerhoff and his wife to be smuggled out of France across the Pyrenees by foot, with the help of a Rockefeller Foundation grantee, the Unitarian Services Committee. Once in Lisbon, the Meyerhoffs finally and safely boarded a ship to the United States. McKinsey actually faced his own perilous escape from Nazi-occupied France, and I paraphrase from his diary. An alert in Bordeaux region obliges us to leave. We must drive without any lights. The result is a rather serious accident which unfortunately damaged the car. My mother-in-law is wounded, and so is Anatole. It is entirely the other man's fault, but we cannot take any more risk. With the help of many individuals, including staff from the Red Cross, McKinsey and his family would finally make it to Lisbon, and he continued to help more than 100 other scholars escape. But the work was increasingly painful. They knew, as I said, that they held life and death in their hands. Many put their own funds into the project, and many, and we see this in the diaries, diverted other foundation funds without alerting the president, I might add, to do more. Other gut-wrenching entries come from the tormented soul-searching of foundation leaders towards the end of World War II, as they began to learn that the cyclotron that they had funded to advance medical research was in full service of developing the atomic bomb. They debated this, and they were deeply distressed. But ultimately, they agreed to keep the funding flowing to the project, even once they learned of its goal. No one was more tormented than the then president, Raymond Fosdick. Upon hearing the news of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he pulled his car over by the side of the road and threw up. In a report to the board later that year, he put the decision in this context, and I quote, "Whether the release of atomic energy in the long run will result in good or evil for the race, no one now can say. But whatever the consequences, the Foundation and its related boards cannot escape their share of the responsibility, indirect as it may be. It is a tragic irony that when men have been most successful in the pursuit of truth, they have most endangered the possibility of human life on this planet. The towering question which now faces the world is whether the new energies can be controlled. It is, I know, the hope of all of us that the Foundation may be able to make some contribution, however slight, to this end." Now, I recognize that I've told some pretty dark tales, but I'd like to end on a lighter note. Returning to another memo to Rockefeller officers, again written by Warren Weaver, with some pertinent advice on how we must not measure our successes. He advises, "It seems almost too childish to mention, but it is not very realistic to ask a recipient of a grant whether it has proved profitable to him. What in the name of Emily Post do you expect him to say?" The National Research Council, trying to assess the value of their fellowship program that was financed by the Rockefeller Foundation, wrote to every fellow and asked him whether he had profited from the fellowship. I think one man wrote back no, and I've always wanted to meet him. I could go on, but I will stop there because we have so much in store for you tonight. But the point I hope I've made is that while the act of philanthropy is about helping others write their stories, it is important that we take time every now and again, maybe once every 100 years, to recognize our own and to preserve those stories so that future generations might learn from us, perhaps be entertained by us, but always better understand this moment in time and what drove us to make the decisions that we did. Because I believe that when we look back at this time in philanthropy's history, it will clearly be a launching pad for many of the amazing transformations that we will see in the next 100 years. And that is something to celebrate indeed. So thank you again for joining us.